Okay, so I've got a question for you about that pattern in the story of Adam and Eve. So in We Who Wrestle with God, I take apart the story of Adam and Eve in more depth than I've managed previously, delving into the notion that the fundamental sin of both Adam and Eve is one of pride, right? That's their temptation by Lucifer, the serpent. Their temptation to become as gods, which is the temptation that's first offered to Eve, right? And she accepts that. Her desire is to establish the foundations of the moral order subjectively, which is happening everywhere in the world at the moment, by the way, and promoted not least by like hyper-inclusive women. So that's very interesting to see. A sin of pride, she's going to take it to herself to establish the moral foundations. And then she attempts that, and then Adam exceeds, which is his sign, the sign of his prideful weakness. And so you have Adam and Eve as the archetypes of male and female. You have Adam as the namer and the subduer, and Eve as the helpmeet, so to speak, the ezer kenegdo, I think is the phrase, who brings things to his attention that he's left outside of the ordered structure, right? And then each of those patterns has its associated sin. Now, in the story of Adam and Eve, suffering and death enters the world with sin. Now, I've really been trying to figure that out because on the one hand, no, because everything dies and suffers. And on the other hand, well, wait a minute. A lot of suffering, especially the unbearable sort, is brought about by misaligned aim and pride and the desire to usurp. Like a lot of it. Like, who knows? Well, that's the question. Who knows how much? And so then you might ask yourself, if we aimed upward unceasingly, if we were perfect, as Christ calls upon his followers to be in the gospel accounts, what would become of suffering? And what would become of death? Now, you have this interesting idea in the Gospels that Christ's radical acceptance of the terrible preconditions for being produced the victory over death and evil.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's something about that that's right, because the more you open yourself up to the realities of the dark side of life, death and malevolence, let's say, clearly the more capable you are of dealing with it. And we don't know the ultimate extent of that. And we don't know what it would mean to, this is where my knowledge just ends, as I tried to indicate to Dawkins, these texts, move out into the ineffable. Yeah. I could ask you the same question he asked me, a variant of it. It's like, do you believe the resurrection happened?
Yeah, we don't live in the same, I would say, this is, okay, we need to talk about this for sure. Like, we definitely need to talk about this because this is, I understand why it's the most difficult thing for secularists to kind of get to.
Yeah.
But the reality is that at some point, you start to notice that the patterns that we're talking about, they are the patterns that inform the structure of reality, right? That they are the patterns by which we notice that we even identify things as having existence, that we can see their value, that we can weigh their value in the same way that you're talking about. So those patterns are, let's say, our perception of those patterns have been refined over time. We start to notice that these are the ones that actually top down, in some ways, constrain reality. And so in the end, the idea that those patterns would happen, it doesn't bother me one bit. Like, it doesn't bother me to think that as the image of the resurrection, let's say, the image of the notion that you said, exactly, like that if you are willing to give up your prideful holding on to something and you're willing to die for all intents and purposes, that is when life becomes abundant. That is when life becomes real. And you can see that, right? All the tingling of that in the Old Testament with Abraham offering up his son, all of these things happen. But the idea is that if that is the pattern of reality, then to me, it doesn't bother me one bit that it just happened. I don't have an explanation for it from the bottom up because that's not why I care for it. I care about it because I can see top down from constraining stories, I can see that it's the most affording story.
Yeah.
So if someone says,
Yeah, well,
finally,
I'm
they say that this man that represents the pattern perfectly, that it happened in his life, that he resurrected, but I can't explain the physical like reasons and the physical mechanical ways in which it happened. At that point, honestly, I don't care because I know that it's real because of what it affords. And the question is like, and this is the big question is,
Well, that's how Dawkins defined the reality of quantum mechanics, by what it affords.
yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the right way to think about it, is that it's just that it's not the same type of affordance. It's an affordance of everything. It's an affordance of everything that we find valuable, everything that we think is worth pursuing, everything that, that binds our societies together. That's what it affords.
The problem I'm having increasingly, so to speak, as a materialistic reductionist, let's say, as a scientist,
Yeah.
is that it's becoming more preposterous for me to believe that it didn't happen than it is to believe that it did happen.
Because there's also another one, which is because, the incipient, thing hiding behind the idea that, for example, the crucifixion, that the resurrection or the virgin birth didn't happen, is that someone lied. That's what's there underneath. And if you listen to someone like Dawkins for long enough, he'll say, right, that the disciples just made it up, Jordan.
Yeah.
They just made it up. Jesus didn't resurrect. They just lied.
Yeah.
And so, and that's a big deal because, okay, so that means that our civilization is based on a lie.
That's right.
Yeah. We have to take that into account. And
then what are, yeah.
What does a lie afford?
Well, and then you might say, let's assume that they lied for power and prestige. So we'll use the
That's
postmodern
hilarious.
critique.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are implications to the fact that our culture is based on a lie that people told for power and prestige. That is exactly the postmodern Marxist critique. That's exactly it. And the cancer that's eating the universities that Richard Dawkins loves is predicated on exactly that viewpoint.
And this Christian story handles that problem in its very structure, which is that it kind of sucks for them, but all of Jesus' disciples were killed. All of Jesus' disciples were imprisoned, tortured, and killed. And so in the structure of the Christian story, the idea that they would have lied in order to gain for themselves any kind of prestige and power, and that they all died holding on to that story, and all of them tortured and killed, is a pretty interesting idea, and the Babylon Bee made a hilarious video about that, where the disciples are sitting there around the fire and they're like, we're going to make it up. We're going to steal his body and then pretend he's resurrected. And then they're like, and then we'll all be rich and famous. Mm-hmm. And the answer is no. And then we'll all be horribly tortured and killed. And everybody's, cheering as if that's what they want. But that is something that's encapsulated in the Christian story, which is that the fact that the very people who witnessed these events, that they didn't gain anything from that at all.